Mr. President.
The Senator from Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. President. Are we in a quorum call?
We are.
I would ask that it be vitiated, please.
Without objection.
Thank you. On August 16th, as everything was collapsing in Afghanistan, President Biden said, quote, "We've developed counterterrorism over-the-horizon capability that will allow us to keep our eyes firmly fixed on any direct threats to the United States in the region, and to act quickly and decisively if needed," end quote. He was stating that we don't have to have an on-the-ground presence in Afghanistan to keep Americans safe, and that we can rely instead on over-the-horizon strikes, where we use drones and other assets to take out terrorists from hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Since then, we've learned that the President wasn't being truthful. At the Senate Armed Services Committee's open hearing on Afghanistan's disaster, CENTCOM Commander General Kenneth McKenzie testified on the immense challenges that we face in preventing terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS from using Afghanistan as a launching pad to attack us here at home. What President Biden seems to conveniently ignore is that a successful over-the-horizon counterterrorism strategy requires more than just the ability to hit targets across long distances. We also have to be able to identify targets. We have to be able to locate targets, and we have to be able to reach those targets. To do this effectively, we first need a U.S. presence in the region, or at least a reliable on-the-ground partner there. Without that, our ability to gather the intelligence necessary to pick the right targets is severely degraded. We saw the tragic consequences of acting on incomplete intelligence on August 29th, when a drone strike mistakenly killed 10 innocent Afghans, including 7 children, and an aid worker with ties to the United States. Second, we need a reliable way to actually get to the target. President Biden likes comparing Afghanistan to countries like Yemen and Syria, but there's a huge difference between these countries. Afghanistan is landlocked, and our drones can't just fly over the ocean to get there, like they can to Syria and to Yemen. When it comes to Afghanistan, our drones have to cross over other countries on the way, and those countries are not obligated to allow us to use their airspace. General McKenzie confirmed to me during our hearing that because we have withdrawn from Afghanistan, we need to rely on Pakistan's airspace if we want to reach targets like ISIS-K or Al-Qaeda. And that should concern every American. Pakistan historically is the Taliban's fiercest international supporter, and they could revoke our access at any point. And if they do, we would need to ask China, Iran, or Central Asian nations with close ties to Russia for permission to use their airspace or even their bases in order to conduct counterterrorism operations. When I asked about this during the SASC hearing, Secretary Austin confirmed recent reports that the U.S. military, the finest fighting force in the world, that they've had conversations with Russia about using their bases in Central Asia nations on Afghanistan's northern border. Secretary Austin insisted that we haven't asked for Russia's permission to use these bases. We're simply considering an offer that they made. But if we have to consider an offer from the Kremlin just to keep Al-Qaeda from surging back in Afghanistan, President Biden hasn't put America on a very strong footing. The bottom line is that our chaotic exit from Afghanistan has made it much, much harder for the United States military to keep the American people safe from terrorists. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, said during last week's hearing that presidents are elected to make strategic decisions. He also told us that Afghanistan withdrawal was a strategic failure, and he was right. The way things stand today, we are at risk of recreating the same conditions that existed before 9/11. The Taliban are running things in Kabul, and given their long-standing partnership with al-Qaeda, it is naive to expect that they would prevent these terrorists from operating freely. Anyone who says that we are safer today than we were 20 years ago is getting ahead of themselves. And that goes for President Biden, too. He needs to be more honest about what his decision to leave Afghanistan, no matter the cost, means for our nation's security. Real leaders take responsibility for their mistakes. They do not make excuses for them. And unfortunately, that is all we have heard from the president so far. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President, may I ask to be recognized?
Senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, over the past, well, first of all, let me just agree with the senator from Nebraska. She's exactly on target here. This is the problem. We're in I've said several times, I cannot remember a time that we have not been, that we've been a greater threat than we are today. Over the past 2 weeks, just kind of let you know where we are now. The Armed Services Committee held 2 classified sessions and 2 open hearings on Afghanistan. That's the committee that made these, that actually had these in their schedule. These are really eye-openers, and I think we have a lot of time to uncover about what happened and where we go from here. First, we heard from General Miller, the commander on the ground in Afghanistan through July. He went up to July period of time. Then we heard from the Pentagon's top policy official, Colin Kahl. In open testimony, we heard from Secretary of Defense Austin, the President's top military advisor, General Milley, General McKenzie, who is in charge of the combatant command that oversees the Middle East. We also heard from 2 outside experts with decades of experience following Afghanistan and the region. Here's what we learned. I'm going to list these things. There are actually 7 things that we learned. This is very significant. One, we learned that top military leaders advised President Biden to keep at least 2,500 troops. Now, the president came out and said that wasn't true, and yet every military person who's offered testimony has said, yes, that's exactly true. They all recommended to President Biden to keep at least 2,500 troops in Afghanistan. If not, then you know what results are coming from that, and you know what we're living with today. Now, this advice goes counter to what President Biden told the American people back in August. He said his generals did not advise him to leave troops there. Now we know that that's just not true. And we know that he said that and he misled the American people. This is the very significant point. The second thing, out of 7, we learned that al-Qaeda was never gone from Afghanistan. As Biden says, they were there all along, and they were a big part of the Taliban's victory. Now they're focused on external operations. Al-Qaeda and ISIS could be able to strike America's soil as soon as a year from now. That's striking us on our soil, here in America. Even worse, the withdrawal of Afghanistan was a shot of adrenaline in the arm of the radical Islamic terrorists everywhere. They're now having a victory to point to. The third thing, we learned that by completely withdrawing from Afghanistan, we nearly zeroed out our capabilities to strike those same terrorist organizations. We understand this. Not many people would disagree with this. General McKenzie said he was not confident that the United States would be able to prevent al-Qaeda or ISIS from using Afghanistan as a launching pad for terrorist activity, and here's why. And this is important. The administration isn't talking about this. Afghanistan poses a unique set of challenges. It's landlocked. We don't have any bases nearby, and this was driven home by our senator a few minutes ago from Nebraska. Our generals confirmed that it's extremely difficult and costly to get the intelligence and conduct the types of operation the president said he would do. And this came from all of the military leaders. Let's not forget, we still have killed the terrorists directly responsible, have not killed the terrorists directly responsible for the attack that killed 13 United States service members. Just imagine that. They're still out there. President Biden decided to put the Taliban in charge, hoping they'd change. The first thing they did was broadcast a video on Afghan national TV saying the United States deserved the 9/11 attacks. Turns out that the Taliban is the old Taliban. They haven't really changed a bit. And what this means is that Afghanistan is now the safest place in the world for radical Islamic terrorism. We're at greater risk and we're less safe. The fourth thing, out of 7, we learned, and I quote General McKenzie directly, the war on terror is not over. And the war in Afghanistan is not over either. But President Biden told the American people, told the whole world, that the war is over. We know better than that. Evidently, the terrorists didn't get the memo, as General Milley put it. Al-Qaeda is still at war with us and never has not been. Number 5, we learned without a shadow of doubt that our allies and partners, and our adversaries too, that they are questioning our credibility and resolve. In fact, General Milley said our credibility has been damaged. At least the last week's hearing, our experts confirmed that President Biden's botched withdrawal has caused our allies to question our ability to stick to our strategies and policies. And number 6, we learned that our military leaders would not call President Biden's evacuation operation an extraordinary success like he did. General Milley called it a strategic failure. Now, I want to be clear. This wasn't a failure on the part of our troops. Our troops served admirably. They rescued 120,000 people. They did what they were told to do. Their commander-in-chief led them astray. As Dr. Vali Nasser said just the other day, he told the committee, our committee, last Thursday, the end game in Afghanistan was not our finest moment. That is an understatement, and that's someone trying to figure out some way to justify what went on. And lastly, 7, we learned that President Biden simply ignored the conditions-based approach. Now, one thing I'll say about the previous approach, people are confused as sometimes what our previous president said. He had a condition-based approach, and the hallmark or the center of that condition base was that we would leave troops there to protect our Americans. We don't know right now even how many Americans are there. So we learned that President Biden simply ignored the conditions-based approach. President Biden could have easily said, quote, the Taliban has not met our conditions. We're going to stay in Afghanistan and ensure no terrorists are able to hit us. And that's what his military advisors recommended that he say, and he didn't do that. In fact, President Biden ignored the conditions on the ground and instead decided to accept a significant amount of strategic risk. That means the United States is left safe today, and our credibility for the future is shot through, and that's what his decision means. We lost credibility because we left Americans and our Afghan allies behind. No one will believe what America says after this. And I'm not sure why they should. I can't think of a time in history that this has happened. This is something that just was brand new. One thing we didn't get clear answers on, despite the repeated bipartisan requests, exactly how many Americans and Afghan partners did we leave behind, and what's going to happen to them. DOD pointed out to the State Department and vice versa, and that's just unacceptable. We don't know how many people we left behind. You know, the Secretary actually made a statement approximating at one time between 300 and 400 and 500, and the next approximation was closer to 10,000. So we don't really know that. It's bad enough that we leave them behind, but we don't even know how many people we leave. So these are the answers. This is why I'm going to continue calling for more hearings until we get them. We got to get the answers to this. This isn't going to go away. And why does all of this matter? America is less safe than we were before because of President Biden's decisions. 6 years ago, former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates said, quote, I think Biden has been wrong on every major foreign policy and national security issue over the past 4 decades. America is now more vulnerable to terrorist attacks. We all understand that, and the whole world understands that. And we have no plan to meet that threat. We also have to think about what this means for our biggest challenge, and that is, of course, our challengers of China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. They're all celebrating now. China is engaged in a historic nuclear buildup, one that we've never seen anything like before. Russia just conducted its largest military exercise in 4 decades. They are watching this debacle and thinking how weak America looks. You know, if President Biden can't get counterterrorism right, how can his administration put together a strategy to confront China and Russia? Unfortunately, the strategic failure of our Afghanistan exit is encouraging our adversaries to test us, the exact opposite of deterrence. And that's what I'm worried about now. I'm more worried about it after last week. That's why I'm going to keep fighting for more open hearings so that the American people and our adversaries and our enemies and our friends will understand what it's all about, and this would be the real America, not what they experienced recently. So that's why I continue to push for adequate defense funding to make sure that we prioritize nuclear modernization and to pass this year's NDAA as soon as we can get it to the floor. And by the way, this is the one bill that I have every expectation we will get. The NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, is one that we have passed for 61 consecutive years. I have every expectation that we will do it now. I don't like the idea that the Democrats are putting this off, and as if there is a threat out there. I don't think that's going to happen. But that's why we got to keep getting to the bottom of this. We've taken up some big hits out there, and we got to recover. Okay? With that, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from North Dakota.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I'm here today to join my colleagues and first associate myself with all of the words from the ranking Republican from the Armed Services Committee, Senator Inhofe. Very well said, Senator, and I agree wholeheartedly. And I express my profound disappointment in President Biden's handling of the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan. Madam President, the American people, and certainly my constituents in North Dakota are upset, and they have every right to be. For weeks, we were inundated with horrifying stories of Americans and our allies fleeing for their lives, paired with a constant stream of disturbing images and videos out of Afghanistan as it was taken over by the Taliban. Yet somehow President Biden has the audacity to call the withdrawal a, quote, extraordinary success. Well, President Biden's wrong. It was not an extraordinary success. The withdrawal was an abject failure. And President Biden bears all of the responsibility for it. And that is to say, he is the reason that it was an abject failure. Because our heroes in uniform did an incredible job against very difficult odds and frankly, with very poor leadership coming from the Oval Office. The reality is that the president misled the American people to justify his decisions and to downplay his failures. And now, our terrorists are emboldened, our allies are questioning the United States' resolve, and the United States is less safe because of it. The reality is, his deceitful rhetoric really began several months ago. In August, he led us to believe our military leaders were united in their support of his withdrawal plans. Like many of my colleagues, I expressed concerns at the time when his plans were first announced and urged him to follow a conditions-based withdrawal. He did not. And to rationalize his choices, he worked to convince us, the most senior leaders in the Pentagon, were standing behind him, agreed with him. They gave him this advice, he said. And as we've heard from multiple generals, that is simply not true. The president also misled us about the conditions on the ground in Afghanistan. In an August speech, he said the Afghan military force had, quote, 300,000 strong, incredibly well-equipped fighters. The Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction said in a report, that's not true. It said of the 300,000 members of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, only 182,000 of them were Afghan National Army members, and the rest were members of the Afghan National Police. Well, Madam President, when I discuss the numbers of service members in our armed forces, I don't include the number of police officers or even FBI agents. That would be inaccurate at best and deceitful at worst. Yet here the president is doing exactly that. President Biden used that 300,000 number to claim the Afghan government could defend itself. And he later tried to say no one could predict their forces would fall so quickly. Was he being dishonest with the American people, or was he just not being given accurate information by his senior leadership about the conditions there? Well, neither ignorance nor incompetence are a very good answer. Later in the month, when it became clear the withdrawal was going to be a failure, President Biden insisted the United States would get all Americans who wanted to leave out of Afghanistan. Well, he didn't. He failed. And no one, including him, and least of all him, wants to take responsibility. The State Department says, talk to the Defense Department. The Defense Department says, talk to the State Department. But no one is taking responsibility. And I say the buck stops in the Oval Office with the president, who let that happen and who's letting his team dodge taking responsibility, all while Americans fear for their lives in a country run by terrorists and the terrorist sympathizers. Near the end of August, after 13 brave U.S. military members were killed in an ISIS-K terrorist attack during the botched withdrawal, President Biden rushed to release a statement taking credit for this retaliatory drone strike. He said, quote, I said we'd go after the group responsible for the attack on our troops and innocent civilians in Kabul, and we have, he said. Well, except he hadn't. It was later revealed, as we know, that the strike did not take out any ISIS-K leaders. In fact, it took out 10 civilians, including 7 children. But since then, the president said nothing. He didn't say anything about this horrifying revelation when it was clear that he misled the American people in the wake of the strike. Our military leaders did not agree with the withdrawal plans. The Afghan army was not prepared to defend itself. We did not get every American out of the country, and justice was not delivered to ISIS-K or its leaders after it killed 13 American heroes. And what now, Madam President? What do we have to show for it? Well, America is less safe than it was when President Biden became president. As our top military leaders testified, in yet another contradiction of President Biden's claims, Al-Qaeda is alive in Afghanistan and looks to carry out a strike right here on American soil. How are we supposed to stop it? Our military leaders don't have faith in the over-the-horizon strategy that President Biden repeatedly touts to give us reliable information. Who's going to help us? Our strongest allies and partners and longest-standing friends vocally distance themselves from us amid this botched withdrawal. This, Madam President, all of this is what President Biden called an extraordinary success. Well, it's an extraordinary embarrassment is what it is. The American people are smart enough to not fall for such an obvious attempt to hide the truth from them. That's why we on the Armed Services Committee are going to continue investigating the withdrawal and holding the Commander-in-Chief accountable for his poor judgment and actions, even if he won't take the responsibility. That's what our constituents expect and deserve, and I urge my colleagues to join in supporting those efforts. And I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Madam President. Tomorrow marks the 20th anniversary of Operation Enduring Freedom and the beginning of those combat operations in Afghanistan. It's a benchmark that makes what has happened on the ground during and since our disastrous withdrawal from Kabul all the more disgusting. Over the past 2 months, we've listened in disbelief as mouthpieces of the State Department, the Pentagon, the White House talked about the Taliban in the same way they would have addressed a legitimate governing body. Last week, during a hearing before the Armed Services Committee, we saw our civilian and military leaders evade responsibility for the violence, death, chaos that has occurred on their watch. But we also listened closely as they revealed appalling inconsistencies between the spin from the White House and the reality of the situation on the ground. Here is the reality. Afghanistan is under the control of terrorists. These terrorists have long-standing ties with Al-Qaeda and the Haqqani network, and those relationships aren't going to take a back seat now that the Taliban is in charge of the entire country. This was no ordinary transfer of power. Afghanistan isn't Germany or France or the United States, and we shouldn't pretend that it is, because it's impossible to act as a legitimate government when your goal is not to govern, but your goal is to manipulate through acts of terror. This is what the Taliban is doing, and it's not happening in secret. The cameras are rolling, the world is watching. Inclusivity clearly isn't a priority as much as the White House would like to make out that it is. The Taliban cleared out the Women's Affairs Ministry and replaced it with, and I quote, Ministry for Preaching and Guidance and the Propagation of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice, end quote. The Taliban's desire to curry favor with China has Uyghurs living in Afghanistan running scared. Afghanistan was a haven for these people during the Cultural Revolution, and now the families of those who fled are afraid that the Taliban is going to round them up. Yes, round up the Uyghur Muslims and sell them, that is right, sell them to the Chinese Communist Party in exchange for economic aid. Fears that the Taliban would weaponize access to the internet became reality before the last American left the country. They're well on their way to creating a tightly controlled online cesspool of dangerous anti-Western propaganda. Meanwhile, the Afghan economy is in the gutter. The Taliban's military campaign shut down basic commerce in much of the country, making food shortages worse and putting 1 million children at risk of starvation and death. Healthcare infrastructure is collapsing, and now the Afghan people are facing the possibility of blackouts because the Taliban can't be bothered to figure out how they're going to pay the electric bill. And what intel we do have suggests that al-Qaeda will use this chaos void left by Biden's disastrous withdrawal to rebuild their operations. That's right, al-Qaeda is present in Afghanistan. Madam President, I think it's important to understand that all of this violence and disorder barely scratches the surface of what the Taliban is capable of instigating. On August 20th, President Biden stated with absolute certainty, and I quote, "I have seen no question of our credibility from our allies around the world," end quote. During last week's hearing, General Milley disagreed with that assessment. I disagree with that assessment, as do many Tennesseans that I talk with when I'm home every weekend. They understand that Operation Enduring Freedom may have come to an end, but that the world is still watching to see how the United States of America is going to respond to one of the most anti-equality, anti-peace, anti-freedom organizations on the face of the earth. Our actions and our reactions will inform those from the rest of the world, and it's time for the Biden administration to recognize that and to act accordingly. I yield the floor.
The senator from Mississippi.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that Senator Rounds and I be allowed to speak for 5 minutes each before the vote.
Without objection.
Thank you, ma'am. And it gives me no pleasure to stand on the Senate floor today and talk about President Biden's ill-advised and chaotic withdrawal. To talk about the consequences for the people of Afghanistan who trusted us and who took our side for 20 years, and to talk about the tremendous harm it has done to America's reputation. The president, I think, believes that the cost of this debacle has been only a few weeks of bad press, but I think he's sadly wrong. Perhaps the president is banking on the American people forgetting that the disaster took place on his watch. But it turns out, Madam President, this is a disaster of historic proportions. We will be reeling from this debacle for years and decades to come. The president may try to change the subject, but the cold truth is that our nation will be paying the price when we are dead and gone, and these pages are in a position of senior leadership in this country. Last week, my colleagues and I on the Armed Services Committee heard directly from our nation's top military leaders who had been advising the president on Afghanistan. Their testimonies made clear what we had known all along, that President Biden not only ignored their advice, which he has the power to do as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, but that he then misrepresented that advice to the American people. In a national TV interview, when asked whether the top military advisors had recommended leaving a small troop presence behind to keep a lid on the situation, which would have kept all hell from breaking loose, the president insisted that no one, to his knowledge, had made that recommendation. Madam President, we know that statement by Joe Biden was not true. the president got good advice and then incredibly pled ignorance. He also got good advice from Democrats. And I would point out my colleague from Rhode Island, Senator Whitehouse, when this was first broached in an open meeting and the administration was explaining what was going to take place, Senator Whitehouse said, "This sounds like it's going to be a lot like the fall of Saigon in April of 1974. Senator Whitehouse, as the son of a Foreign Service officer, had an all too close recollection of the disaster that occurred in Saigon back in the 70s. And he warned the administration officials that this might happen again. And yet, the president said no one, to his knowledge, made this recommendation or gave these warnings. This is a president who promised to shoot straight with the American people, who said in February, quote, "You can handle anything as long as you're told the truth." I wish the president actually believed that and subscribed to that and lived by that. The American people can handle the truth, and they need to be told the truth. Here's one bit of hard truth from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley. Our exit from Afghanistan was a, quote, strategic failure, unquote, from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. It has caused, quote, damage, unquote, to America's credibility. That from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I appreciate him leveling with the committee, leveling with the American people. That damage was on full display this past weekend when the former Afghan ambassador, Adela Raz, was asked by Axios, "Do you still trust the United States?" Her answer was simple, bleak, and understandable. No, sorry. That was her answer. No, sorry. She does not trust the United States anymore. This loss of trust extends far beyond Afghanistan. As General Milley noted, and I quote again, "Our credibility with allies and partners around the world and with adversaries is being intensely reviewed by them." And then he said, yes, damaged is the correct word. Simply put, when we abandon our friends, our partners around the world start to wonder if they can trust us, if we'll have their backs. This hurts our ability to cooperate with our allies, to deter threats, and to provide security for the American people, and it emboldens our adversaries to act more aggressively. We've already seen this from China in the past week. China has been signaling to Taiwan by ramping up their air missions near Taiwan. They've been signaling to our friends in Taiwan that America is an unreliable partner. Even before our troops had fully left Kabul, Chinese media wasted no time predicting that we will also abandon friends in Taiwan if and when China invades that country. A matter of concern. Will this embolden Iran, terrorist groups in Pakistan who support the Taliban and remain a serious concern? But perhaps the worst breach of trust in this dark chapter was between our government and our own people. During the withdrawal, President Biden assured us on national television, and I quote the president's grammar, "If there's American citizens left in Afghanistan, we're going to stay to get them all out. If there's American citizens left in Afghanistan, we're going to stay to get them all out." Days later, that promise went out the window. The president dismissed those Americans staying by saying many of them wanted to stay in Afghanistan. Madam President, this repeated pattern of broken promises and failure on our to own these decisions will only further weaken our country, our alliances, and our national security. Sadly, we must get about the business of rehabilitating our reputation with our allies and the way our enemies and adversaries look at us. I stand with my colleagues today who are committed to holding this administration accountable. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
The senator from South Dakota.
Thank you, Madam President. Tomorrow marks the 20th anniversary of the day the United States entered Afghanistan, the beginning of Operation Enduring Freedom. On October 7th, 2001, the United States military conducted its first strike on the terrorists responsible for attacking our nation on 9/11. As President Bush said on that day, it was not a mission we asked for, but a mission that we would fulfill. For the past 2 decades, brave men and women have answered the call and put on the uniform of our country to fight terrorists in the name of freedom. We were a beacon of hope in a region of chaos. Our presence made a difference. As I travel my home state of South Dakota, I've heard from many people who were disturbed by the events that unfolded during our final days in Afghanistan. I share their frustrations. Together, we watched the Taliban forcefully regain control of an entire country that we worked so hard to keep free from terrorist groups. We watched the credibility of the United States on the world stage diminish as we carelessly left our friends and allies behind. We watched civilians hopelessly cling to the wings of aircraft in desperate hope of escape. And we watched 13 brave men and women in uniform lose their lives while helping others seek freedom. As we mourn the loss of their lives, we recognize and appreciate their service to our nation. We also remember all those who fought by our side for 20 years, many of whom remain trapped in Afghanistan. A citizen of South Dakota, Brandy Roseland, a veteran from Belfouche, worked as a contractor in Afghanistan. That's where she met her interpreter. According to Brandy, her interpreter served with the highest distinction and faced great personal risk, often putting himself in harm's way to aid and protect Americans and his fellow Afghans. On one such occasion, Brandy's interpreter discovered an American contractor who died in an accident outside of Kabul. The interpreter single-handedly returned the contractor's body, as well as sensitive equipment and documents, to the United States Embassy. That took courage. Brandy returned to the United States, but she stayed in contact with her interpreter. When Afghanistan began to fall to the Taliban, she knew that she needed to do all she could to help him get out safely. That's when Brandy called us and asked if we could help him escape the clutches of the Taliban. For weeks, our office worked relentlessly to maneuver his application for a special immigrant visa throughout the bureaucratic process at the State Department. Our work was ultimately successful from an administrative standpoint, but the overall mission was a failure. While we had done all we could to help the interpreter receive his visa, our forces had exited before he could get on a plane to safely because of the president's date uncertain, which he set for withdrawal. Today, this interpreter remains in hiding in Afghanistan. If he is found by the Taliban, his fate will certainly be sealed. We all know that there are no easy answers when it comes to Afghanistan, but there was clearly a wrong one. For months, we had warned of the perils of making an arbitrary decision based on the calendar as opposed to an assessment of the conditions on the ground. And we weren't alone. As the only Republican member of both the Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committees, I've had the opportunity these past few weeks to hear from the senior military officers who advised President Biden, General Milley, Secretary Austin, and General McKenzie. Their message to the President was clear. A withdrawal on a date certain without conditions would lead to the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban. Despite receiving the best military advice in the world, President Biden decided to use his own judgment, and he made the wrong decision. His directive to withdraw on a date certain, without regard for the conditions on the ground, needlessly put American soldiers in harm's way and forced our military to undertake an assignment which they simply could not totally complete. Our military simply ran out of time. They could not get all of our Americans out, and they could not get all of our Afghan allies out, including Brandy's interpreter. But it didn't have to end this way. Our military leaders offered the president the correct path forward. Their commander-in-chief failed them. Lately, the president has blamed a lot of people for his failure. This includes the Afghan security forces and his own generals, who he falsely claimed advised him to make this decision. But this does not fall on any of them. President Biden owns this debacle, and history will not judge him kindly. Because of his error, Al-Qaeda now has a breeding ground. America is less safe. The world is less safe. I'll close with a message for our veterans. While I was governor, I attended 31 funerals in South Dakota for South Dakotans who died fighting in the War on Terror. We will not forget their sacrifice nor their families' loss. While freedom may not endure in Afghanistan today, for 20 years, you veterans, you protected our nation and kept the fight away from our doorstep. Your service was not in vain. Your sacrifice made a difference. You represent the best of our country, and your nation is grateful. Please always remember, it is not the politician who protects our right to vote. It is not the journalist who protects our freedom of speech. And it is not the preacher who protects our freedom of religion. All of our freedoms are defended and protected generation after generation by the men and women who put on the uniform of the United States of America. We are grateful to you for your sacrifice and your service. May God continue to bless all of you veterans, and may the good Lord continue to bless these United States of America. Thank you, Madam President. I yield.